Well, good morning, and again, welcome to Gateway Church. My name is Wes Dickson. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's my joy to be with you all this morning. If you missed last week, then you wouldn't know that we're now in the middle of a three-part series on the story of the prophet Elijah called Against the Current. Last week, we talked about what I called the undercard in the bout between the Lord God of Elijah and the God of the Phoenicians, Baal. And in that message, we saw and explored which God was truly the provider for his people. And it was shown that the God of Elijah, our God, is provider in life and death, and that unlike Baal, the Lord can be trusted in all things. Today in our text, we're jumping into the battle of the gods again, but this time we come to what is seen in the life of Elijah as the main card of the fight, where the duel comes to its height. When I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of boxing with my dad, and boxing is a sport that garners a lot of interest due to what happens inside the ring. You know, two men enter, one man exits. That's kind of the idea. There are jabs, there are hooks, there are uppercuts, and many watch it for this reason. But part of the intrigue in boxing, and in all sports for that matter, are the stories that are found outside of the ring, the stories that give context and weight to the matches that will follow. And one of our favorite stories as people that we all love to pay attention to is the story of the underdog. One of the most famous in boxing, for example, was the knockout of Mike Tyson by Buster Douglas. On February 11th in 1990, Mike Tyson entered into the ring with a perfect 37-0 record against the underdog, Buster Douglas, with a 27-4-1 record. A record that nobody laughed at, but it was nothing compared to the amazing Mike Tyson. Against all odds, and not without controversy, Douglas in the 10th round would defeat Tyson in knockout fashion, stunning the whole world. Now, Douglas would go on to lose his championships not even a year later, and he would never again reach those heights, but his name lives forever in boxing glory for defeating one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And again, why this is remembered and so important in the boxing world is that Douglas was an underdog. The victory wasn't supposed to happen. These are the sports stories that last the test of time. We saw it in our context with the 2019 Raptors, the team that had never won, finally getting through and winning the NBA title. There's the Miracle on Ice story about the American amateurs who upset the Soviet ice machine in the 80s. There's the Maple Leafs. No, I'm kidding. We're talking about underdogs, not dead dogs. It's good, eh? Anyways, my point is this. We all love a good underdog story. And this is true inside and out of sports. For example, sometimes when the stars miraculously align and pigs fly, I'll win an argument against my wife, Beth. And I feel like an underdog, man. I feel like the winner that shouldn't have won. And it's incredible in those moments. Jokes aside, we got an underdog story today on our hands. Today, we're jumping back into the story of Elijah, and we'll be looking at his battle against the prophets of Baal. Elijah finds himself as one of the only faithful, not just prophets, but people in the land of Israel. And in front of him stands a king and a queen who have led the people to worship Baal into idolatry, and they refuse to repent. And around him stand a people who have fallen into this idolatry and who have been committing gross and awful sins against God and each other. And it's at this time that our underdog, Elijah, he comes to stand for the Lord. And today, I want to focus on this story because although we might not in our day and age come into contact with people who outright worship Baal on a daily basis, we do in our own way, I think, find ourselves in a culture that in many ways is opposed to the way of Jesus. We find ourselves in a day when, though the idols might not have names, their worship is still happening. We live in a context, in a culture that though it might be beautiful in certain ways, it's a culture that's filled with a love for sexual immorality, a love for death and our treatment of both the elderly and the unborn, and a culture that more than many things loves money and materials above the person. And the list could go on. And look, I'm not saying everything that we see around us is bad in our world or in our culture. That's not it. But our culture is far from what you would describe as a Christian culture in terms of the actions that we see around us. And because of this, as we briefly mentioned last week, we as Christians, we will naturally stand out if we're following the ways of Jesus. That's why Jesus says these words, right? A city on a hill cannot be hidden. He is saying that the lights, that shine from that city, they will be obvious, that they will naturally stand out to everybody who looks at them in the night sky. And in the same way, in a culture that doesn't worship Jesus, to look like him, to act like him, to worship him, it will stick out. You will stick out. You will be different, and that's a good thing. But I think sometimes it's It's quite hard. It's hard, for example, to be the only kid in your class who follows Jesus. And likewise, in the workplace, right? Firstly, it can put you in that weird and uncomfortable place of course, standing out because you will. But secondly, it can be quite discouraging to be alone, to not have others with you. It can be in those moments hard to believe that Jesus is going to use you, or to believe that Jesus is really going to bring his gospel and his light through you to those people around you. And it's in this tension and through our story that I want to ask this very simple question today. How can we have confidence as followers of Jesus in the midst of a culture that does not know him? How can we, when we're alone, when the odds are stacked against us, when the chips don't fall in our favor, how can we still show the light of Jesus so brightly? And it's my hope today, as we open up again into the story of Elijah, that we'll find encouragement as those who do stand out. We'll find encouragement as a people who have belief amidst a culture that doesn't believe. And so with all that said, I want to invite you now to open up your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 16. And so you're going to have the Bible page up there. There's your reading. If you put up your hand, you're going to get a blue Bible from one of our connecting team, and then you have a little cheat sheet right here where you don't even have to go looking. The number's right there for the page number if you want it, okay? So I'm going to give you just a moment to get that. We will be highlighting text on our screen today, but for this first portion that we're reading, it's not going to be on the screen. So I suggest you can open up your phone, grab the Bible app, but I would get a Bible in front of you. It keeps us honest up here because you guys get to read along with us. Okay, so again, it's 1 Kings chapter 18, starting in verse 16. And the text reads like this. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people said, "What you say is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called in the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice, but there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention, and we'll stop there for now. So as I said, this is the famous story of the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And this part of the story begins with a guy named Obadiah who lets Ahab know that Elijah is on the scene. Obadiah, in the verses preceding our passage today, is revealed to be a follower of the Lord, and he's actually the palace administrator for the king. So he's a secret follower of the Lord. Elijah, he lets know, is in fact not alone. Though the odds are still quite stacked against him, Obadiah has hidden 100 prophets of the Lord in nearby caves, supplying them each day with food and water. And Elijah receives this news, but replies with his own news to Obadiah. Elijah, who Ahab has been searching for a long, long time now, is going to appear before the king. And we see this in the beginning of our scriptures that we read today. There's a moment of banter between Elijah and Ahab as they show up. And Ahab, upon seeing Elijah, says to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" To which Elijah confidently responds, "It's not he who's made the problem, but Ahab and his family, who worship Baal and Asherah, another Canaanite god. They've brought the drought upon Israel. This is kind of like the pre-fight weigh-ins and like the UFC. The combatants have this moment where they're giving a little trash talk back and forth. But as we're about to see, only one of these men has some bite to back up his bark. And we see this as Elijah moves on to the main event. He proposes a competition. In verse 19, he says this. He says, "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So he hasn't given the description of the competition yet, but it's assumed Ahab kind of understands what's going on, or at least he assumes what's going on. Elijah wants the people to be gathered to witness the prophets of Baal face off against him, the prophet of the Lord. And Ahab, in what we can only assume is sheer overconfidence, agrees to this proposal. And it's not crazy that he might do this. At this point in Ahab's mind, he's got Elijah. He's not getting away. The man he's been searching for has been caught. He can't run anymore, as Ahab and his men would certainly stop him. And so he agrees to the proposal. It's as if Ahab wants to have like a little bit of fun before he kills Elijah. It's like a cat who's caught a mouse and plays with it, or the supervillain who wants to gloat over the hero that he's captured. And so he allows Elijah the platform he wants. He brings the people of Israel to Mount Carmel, which was a large mountain, or for us, maybe like a really large hill in an area that was known as a place of Baal worship in this time. And so with the people gathered, Elijah then takes center stage. And he asks this important question. He says to them, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. So Elijah begins by framing the reason here behind the competition. You as a people, you have wavered between following the Lord and worshiping Baal. And so his point is to settle this debate, to settle the wavering. Only one of these gods can truly be Lord. And so he proposes his competition to solve this. Both sides, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, are to each take a bull and prepare it for sacrifice to their God. But the key is that the prophets are not to light the sacrifice, the bull. Rather, they are to call upon their God to bring fire or lightning down from the sky. And as Elijah puts it so well, he says this, "The God who answers by fire, he is God." Now, it's not a mistake here that Elijah is proposing this challenge. Obviously, the sacrifice makes sense in a battle of the gods, but the call for fire from the heavens, that's intentional. You see, Elijah is putting the ball into Baal's court. Lightning, if you remember from last week, that is Baal's game. He's always pictured with a lightning bolt. You can see it here in this picture. You can't tell, but that there thing up top that he's holding, that's a lightning rod. He's about to strike something. And so if anyone should be able to bring fire from the skies, it certainly should be the Lord of the skies. Elijah here is showing how confident he is in the Lord. He's in Israel at Mount Carmel, which is one of the closest mountains, actually, to the Phoenician land above Israel. It's one of the closest altars of Baal to the very home of Baal. And the game is one that's made up for Baal. If anybody should be able to win, it's Baal. And so we see the prophets of Baal, in these next verses, they begin then to call out to him. In verse 26, "Then they called in the name of Baal from morning till noon. 'Baal, answer us,' they shouted, but there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. So they begin, and there's no answer. And so Elijah, in response to this, he kindly adds some taunting words to get them going. He says this, 'Shout louder,' in verse 27. 'Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened.' So the prophets begin calling out. Nothing happens. Elijah taunts them, and this is meant to be a funny moment. He's like, 'Hey guys, maybe Baal's out right now. Maybe just leave him a message. Or maybe he's asleep. You should wake him up.' Now the prophets of Baal, they don't like this. They're frustrated their God won't act. They're frustrated that Elijah's taunting them. And so they step up their attempts to call to Baal. And we see this in verse 28. So they shouted louder. And they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. The prophets begin to slash and mutilate themselves, which sounds odd to us, but remember last week how I mentioned that to worship Baal, his people would often mimic and act out his stories. They're doing that right there. As a quick refresher, the story of Baal is given to us through the Ugaritic stone tablets that were found dating to about the 12th to 14th century BC. And in these tablets is the story of the death and revival of Baal. Mot, the Canaanite god of death, out of jealousy, he kills Baal. And when he's killed, the tablets state that there was a drought that came upon the land. And Baal's sister Anat, in response, then kills Mot, which allows Baal to return and subsequently the rain along with him. Now, although I mentioned it quickly last week, there is a part of the story here that the prophets are actually acting out. You see, right before Anat goes to take revenge on the god Mot, the Ugaritic tablets state that Anat actually, in mourning the death of Baal, slices herself up. She mutilates herself in some dark and perverse way of mourning the loss of her brother. And so the prophets here are kind of participating in that mourning. We don't know exactly why, what they were thinking or why they did this, but it seems that in some way they're participating in the story. They're encouraging in some way Anat to defeat Mot, and they're attempting in their sick actions to call for the return of Baal and his action upon the scene. But this doesn't work. We see in verse 29, there was no response. No one answered. No one even paid attention. The prophets of Baal, they have all the advantage, but Baal does not respond. It's their altar, nearest to their land, with hundreds of their prophets worshiping Baal with some of their most extreme practices, and nothing happens. And this is all set up by Elijah intentionally. He knows nothing is going to happen because it's not about their quality of worship. It's not about the quality of the worshipers or the prophets. It's actually about the quality of the one being worshiped. Elijah knows they're going to fail because Baal has no power. And we see this to be reversed with Elijah in the Lord's. Elijah has the cards stacked against him. It's just him and no one else who shows up as a prophet of the Lord. He has no advantage. Everyone and everything is against him. And yet we see in the following verses, the Lord shows up. With nothing more than a prayer, Elijah asks the Lord to move, and he moves. Verse 36, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Again, everything is against Elijah. It's just him. That's it. And on top of this, there is no ritual he performs, no magic he enacts. It is just a prayer that he offers. And that's enough for God to move. And this is because it's not about the quality of the worship or the worshiper. It's not about Elijah. It's about the quality of the one who's being worshiped. This story is meant to show you not Elijah versus the prophets, but God versus Baal. Again, it's about the one who's worshiped and the power that he has. And friends, why this matters for us today is that when we find ourselves in moments where we think we're the only ones who follow the Lord, when the odds are stacked against us, I think one of the most important things we can do is remember, it's not about you and your circumstances. They are not the main variable that affects the outcome. The main variable is the one you have faith in. And so to answer our question today, friends, how can we have confidence in the midst of a world that does not follow him? By remembering whose power we have faith in. D.A. Carson, a phenomenal Canadian theologian who serves as a distinguished emeritus professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the States. He has a story from a sermon that he wrote years ago that I think sums this up really, really well. He tells a story about two Jews at the time of the first Passover. Now, if you're new here or you just need a refresher, the Passover comes to us from the book of Exodus, where God was sending plagues to convince Pharaoh, the Pharaoh of Egypt, to release his people from slavery. And the last plague he sends, the highest one, the worst one, is the plague of death. God was sending an angel of death to kill every firstborn in every house in Egypt. And all the people had to do, the people of God, but also the people of Egypt, to avoid this tragedy, was to put the blood of a lamb on their doorposts. That's it. and the angel of death would pass over their house. That's where you get the word from. And so D.A. Carson imagines these two Jewish men by the name of Smith and Brown. And he imagines them in the day before the first Passover, having a little discussion in Egypt. And on that day, Smith says to Brown, man, aren't you like a little nervous with what's going on tonight? Like, isn't this crazy? To which Brown says, well, God told us what to do through his servant Moses. You don't have to be nervous. Haven't you slaughtered the lamb and put blood on the doorpost? Haven't you done that? And Smith replies, well, of course I've done that. I'm not dumb. But it's still pretty scary. Like, there's bugs and a river that turns to blood. All of these plagues, they're awful. And now there's a threat of the firstborn being killed. Well, it's all right for you. You got 3 sons. I just have 1. And I love my son, Charlie. And the angel of death is passing through. And I know what God said, but it's also scary. And the other one, Brown, he looks Smith in the eyes and he says, bring it on. I trust in the promises of God. There is nothing to be afraid of tonight. That night, the angel of death sweeps through the land, and D.A. Carson asks this poignant question: which man lost his son? The answer, of course, is neither. Because death doesn't pass over them on the grounds of the intensity or the clarity of the faith they exercise, but on the ground of the blood of the Lamb. Friends, it is not the quality of your faith, but the quality of who you have faith in. It's not about you or your circumstances. It's about the Lord and what he can do. And this is true in terms of faith and salvation. It's not about the quality of your faith, but your faith in Jesus that saves you. But it also applies to our lives. Right now. This is why Jesus says in Matthew 17, verse 20, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, the smallest known in Jesus' day, you can say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. The moving of the tree in this case is not an action of the person who has faith, but it is an action of the God that this person has faith in. Gateway, when you find yourselves alone in your faith, when you're the only one the Lord has called to a particular place, when you find yourself against insurmountable odds, focus not on the circumstances around you, but on the very God who put you there. It's he who has the power, and it's he, through your faith and trust, that will do incredible things. And you can count on that. Now, we're not quite done here today. There's a little more to the story that I want to focus on, because I think there's something else for us to highlight. So before Elijah, he prays and God moves and strikes the ground with fire. We see this moment where Elijah has the people of Israel make the sacrifice a lot harder. In verse 30, it says this, right before Elijah prays, it reads, then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jugs with water, and pour it on the offering and the wood. Do it again, he said. And they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. Then water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. Again, as we've mentioned a number of times in this message, the cards are stacked against Elijah. It's just him in enemy territory, and all he has is a prayer to offer. But to emphasize this point, that God is Lord, that he is true, Elijah has the Israelites pour water on the sacrifice. And not just a little, he rebuilds the altar of the Lord and proceeds to dig a massive trench around it so that the water is not lost. And he has the people fill up these huge 4 large jugs of water, and they pour it all over the sacrifice, not once, but 3 times. And the bull, and more importantly, the wood, are soaked because of this. The idea here is that this could not be more unlikely to happen. A single prophet with a lone prayer calling down fire to light a soaking and sopping wet sacrifice. But as we read, this does not stop the Lord. Elijah prays, and fire from heaven rains down, and it melts the altar, the wood around it, it melts the bull. Everything is gone, the water too. And I think there is something that is here for us. This emphasis that Elijah places on putting the odds as far as he can against the Lord and himself. It actually adds to our story today. The odds being so aggressively against the Lord adds to the glory and revelation of his power. There is no doubt that the Lord is the one who did this, and there is no doubt that he is God. There is no magic trick that Elijah is playing here. The wood is drenched. There is no overly special ritual performed. It's just a prayer, and yet God shows up in incredible power. You see, the circumstances, they don't work against the Lord, but they actually work for him. And we see this in Israel's response in verse 39. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." To the people of Israel, there was every reason presented for Elijah to fail, and yet God appears in the midst of the doubt and in the midst of the unlikelihood, and his power is shown. And in this way, the weakness of the situation, the hopelessness of it all, it doesn't work against the Lord and Elijah, but actually for them, in that the testimony of what God did is all the greater. And friends, I think this is such an important lesson for us today. Our circumstances, when it seems like we're alone, when it seems like the odds are against us, when it seems like what is in front of you is insurmountable, it is not something to despair in, but something to take hope in, because these circumstances, these negatives, are opportunities for God to demonstrate his power to those around us. And so to add on to our answer today, how can we have confidence in the midst of a world that does not follow him? By remembering whose power we have faith in, yes, but also by remembering that this power is made perfect in our weakness. I went on a missions trip when I was in grade 10, and we went up to a northern Native community in Manitoba. This place was so far up north that you could only reach it by plane during the summer months, and then there was 1 month, February, during the year, where you could take an ice road if you wanted to risk it to get up there. That's it. And so we were, of course, heading by plane up there in the summer to run a children's camp. Now, in preparation for this, we got our team together. We had about 8 people and 2 leaders, and I remember for the most part, man, I loved this team. I had a lot of friends on it, and I liked the leaders, but I remember there was one girl. There was one girl who was on the team that I genuinely had no idea at the time what she was doing on that team. Like, I couldn't fathom why my leaders would pick her. The girl was, in all honesty, a ball of nerves. She was always anxious. She had what was clinically diagnosed as severe social anxiety, which made her extremely hard to talk to. And she I remember, wasn't terribly nice to be around sometimes. She wasn't that funny, and she didn't really have a lot of friends. And I remember thinking to myself, in what was, of course, a horribly judgmental spirit, but I remember thinking, why is she on the team? Like, what is the point here? We have enough. Like, we could do without 8. 7 is fine. But let me tell you this. That girl was the powerhouse of our trip. She prayed with what must have been 7 to 8 to 9 teens that week to receive Jesus in their lives. The children loved her. They came to her each day. The adults loved her. The community loved her. Everybody loved her. And I remember being, frankly, at the end, being just jealous. I remember asking God, why couldn't I do some of these things? And it never came to me when I was younger, but I can obviously see it now, as you guys can too. You see, God's power was resting on this girl in her weakness. Yes, I was being horribly judgmental in my thoughts about her and how I went about that. But to be honest, the foundation was true. She was wildly socially anxious. She had a tough time speaking one-on-one and in public. And at times, she was a quite hard person to be around. That was all true. That's not wrong. And yet, in the midst of that weakness, in the midst of that honest brokenness, she knew God chose to bring his kingdom most powerfully through her. And I'll be honest, I think God was even more glorified that his gospel came from her lips, the girl who was scared to talk to people, because you couldn't deny it. It was the power of God, the Spirit of God himself working in and through a girl who humbly and honestly submitted herself to the Lord in faith. In her weakness, God showed up in strength, and he humbled me at the same time. Paul's words ring true. His power was made perfect in her weakness. And listen, friends, this is almost always how God works. He chooses not as the world chooses. And more than that, I would say most often and most powerfully, God chooses to work in ways that are opposite of what the world chooses. He chooses the weak, the unlikely, the broken, the hurting, and the oppressed. He always chooses places where his power is least expected to come from. And in doing that, he is most glorified and his people are most edified. Listen, here's where the rubber hits the road for us. To the single mom who finds herself without a moment to herself, but who longs to serve the Lord, did you know you are right where Jesus wants you? That you're right in the perfect spot for Jesus to move in power. You might feel forgotten or feel unable to do more than maybe provide for your family at this moment, but did you know in the power of the Lord, through his Spirit, the Lord is willing and able to do mighty things in your life right now? Not in 5 years when things are together, right now. To the young adult who dreams of going on missions, of bringing the gospel to far-off lands, but who can barely, if they're honest, make ends meet, who can barely get out of their parents' basement. Did you know that you are right where you need to be if you're looking to serve the Lord? Like right now, did you know his Spirit is available to you and is looking and longing to bring his gospel through you to the world around you, right now where you are? To the older men and women in our congregation who feel their life has passed them, whose relationships have faded, whose purpose it feels has just long passed them, did you know that you right now where you are where you need to be for the Lord to use you? Like, did you know that the Lord desires right now to work powerfully in your life to serve and work in the lives of others? In all of these cases, and in 1,000 more, friends, what is necessary to access the Lord's power and his influence in your life is not success in a worldly sense. It is not more money or influence or power, but it is simply faith. A faith like Elijah's that says, God can and wants to work in my life. A faith that says, God will work in my life, not in spite of my weakness, but in the midst of it and through my weakness. That is the secret. Draw close to the Lord and surrender to him. Surrender to his will and his power. Lay down yourself as you are in your weakness and vulnerability. Ask him to work his will and power out in your life. And I promise you, in whatever you're going through and whatever odds you find yourself against, even if you're the only one, if you do this, you will see the Lord work in power in your life. Again, if I could leave you with one thing, if you take nothing else, that's great. Take this. It's not the quality of your faith, but the quality of who you have faith in. And God will never forsake or let you down. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the goodness and truth of your word, God. Thank you for the story of Elijah. Father, the man who came as a prophet in a time when Israel was so far from you, God. And Lord, in the midst of that, in the midst of being so alone, in the midst of everything being so unlikely, in the midst of everything being against them, God, he had faith in you, and that was enough. Jesus, would we be people in this world who are able to have faith in you despite what the circumstances might look like? Jesus, would we be people who have faith that you can and want to and desire to use us for your glory, God, as you share your gospel to the world at large? Jesus, we pray that as a church, we would be a light to our community. That though in reference to the rest of our community, we might not have that many people. But God, in our small numbers, would we be a force for your kingdom? In faith, Jesus, we ask that you would use us in power as we go to our schools and our workplaces and wherever else, Jesus. Would you make us people of faith, people who turn to you in the midst of darkness, people who, through your Spirit, bring light. Jesus, we love you and we trust you, and we give this all to you. In your Son's name, Father. Amen.